Hey, what's up guys? Hello, with Football Talk here. Back to talking about every single NFL team once again. But instead of spending an hour on every single division, I want to get the conference done in that time. Let's see if we can do that. So what we'll do here is go north to west, quickly talk about what each team has done this offseason, and how it takes me to a pick of what I believe is the area that these teams should still be looking to address, discussing the options that they have there already, and maybe what they still could be doing. If you haven't done so yet, and you want to listen to some real in-depth analysis of every single draft pick, team by team, I did 40 minutes to an hour on each division, fully committed to that, here on my YouTube channel. And last week I put out my write-up on the most improved position groups in the NFL, which I believe is definitely worth a read if you're interested in those kind of team dynamics and schematic breakdowns. Also make sure to check out my social media handles, which I'll link down below in the description to go with the link to my most recent article. And follow me there if you want to stay up to date or get in touch with me. As for this video, timestamps for all 4 divisions you can also find at the bottom. And now let's just get into this list, starting with the NFC North, with the first team being the Chicago Bears. And other than the position group that I'll talk about in a second here, the Bears actually had some of the least roster turnover of any team in the league, with cornerback Kyle Fuller being their one significant loss, and then of course the whole quarterback situation, letting former number 3 overall pick Mitch Trubisky move on, then all the Russell Wilson trade rumors, only to settle for Andy Dalton, but then making the move of night 1 by trading up for Ohio State's Justin Fields, so it really felt like more than it actually was. As for the position I believe the Bears are least settled in, it depends on what they think gives them the best starting 5 on the offensive line. Second round pick Tevin Jenkins from Oklahoma State is expected to start at left tackle after he primarily played on the right side in college, but the 4 other spots aren't totally settled yet. We obviously know that Cody Whitehair and James Daniels will fill 2 of those 3 interior spots, but they have some options with how they want to deploy them. When I look at the Bears last season, their offense and especially the run game really started clicking when he moved Whitehair to left guard, put in Sam Mustipher at center, and Alex Bars was in there for the injured Daniels at right guard. To get the former Notre Dame teammates next to each other, they could still put Jermaine Ifedi at right guard and move Whitehair back to the pivot, but that creates an even bigger hole at right tackle, where it's now between Elijah Wilkinson or even 5th round pick Larry Borom out of Missouri. Even if they go with my suggested lineup and have Ifedi at right tackle, I've never been a big fan of him on the edge. There's a certain wind-up coming out of his stance as a run blocker, and he has some serious balance issues in pass pro when he has to get into an aggressive kick slide to counter speed. Wilkinson has plenty of starting experience at offensive tackle, filling in for Juwan James, who simply could not stay healthy in Denver, but the Broncos already wanted to replace him 3 years ago, and now they had no issue letting him go, actually opting for former Bears right tackle Bobby Massey instead. While Borom is still a pretty raw rookie, who most teams looked at as a guard, I still don't really get why Chicago got rid of both their starting tackles. Massey's contract ran out, and I actually believe Tevin Jenkins would have been an upgrade there, but by releasing Charles Leno, who was immediately scooped up by Washington, now they asked their rookie to switch sides and create that hole on the other end, so I really didn't like that. That brings us to the Detroit Lions, and we saw a lot more changes in the Motor City, where the new Lions brass admitted that they were not ready to compete, and acquired 2 first-round picks in return for swapping quarterbacks with the LA Rams and taking on Jared Goff's contract, while letting the whole receiver room walk basically, and putting together a new coaching staff, moving on from the mess that Matt Patricia had created, and having Dan Campbell immediately make some noise when he first talked to the press. So looking at the Detroit roster, the obvious weakness in my opinion is a difference-making wide receiver. Tight end TJ Hawkinson is the only proven pass catcher to go along with maybe second-year running back DeAndre Swift. For the 3 new starting receivers potentially, Tyrell Williams hasn't been able to stay healthy these last couple of years. Brashad Perriman has had his flashes, but drops in health have always been issues for him. And I believe 4th round pick Amon-Ra St. Brown will see a heavy target share, but he's not a dynamic over-the-top or yak threat either. Still, there is potential for this trio to exceed expectations. The one real hole I see for Detroit now is the slot defensively. They lost Justin Coleman this offseason, who has been one of the better nickels in the league for a while now when healthy. So now they are looking at Corn Elder, who put up okay numbers last season, allowing 68% of the passes his way to be completed, for a passer rating in the 90s, and maybe if they want to move somebody else in the slot, Quinton Dunbar is the one guy I could see transitioning to that role, who actually had worse numbers in 6 games played last season than Elder in a pretty cornerback-friendly Seattle system, but he has barely any experience in the slot, and the rest of the guys on that roster that demand playing time are all natural outside guys as well, with all of them measuring in at 6'2 plus and not being great at changing directions, I would say. And the new defensive coordinator Aaron Glenn, coming over from New Orleans, who has been influenced in his career by Bill Parcells and Bill Belichick, you would expect him to carry over a man-heavy, matchup-oriented coverage philosophy. That's why I see this as less of a problem with how much the teams in that division put their number one receivers inside anyway, like Devontae Adams, Allen Robinson, and those 2 Minnesota guys who are pretty interchangeable. That would mean that they can still play Amani Oruwariye and Dunbar, or even third-round pick Ifeatu Melifonwu on the field at the same time with Jeff Okudah, who is looking to bounce back from a rough rookie campaign after he was the third overall pick in the draft last year, as the Lions coaches didn't do him any favors either. But to me, they don't have a natural nickel who demands significant snaps on that roster. As far as the Green Bay Packers go, I don't want to spend too much time discussing the whole Aaron Rodgers situation, since that's all we hear anyway, and we need a whole separate video for it. Plus, that is not why I put this piece together. He's currently not at minicamps, but he's still on the roster and will work under that assumption for now. As much as people hated on the Packers' first-round pick Eric Stokes, the Georgia cornerback, I actually thought they addressed arguably their biggest need, allowing to get Kevin King out of the starting lineup after he might have cost them a trip to the Super Bowl. They could still use some more firepower at receiver, but I like the addition of Clemson's Amari Rodgers to allow him to use more 11 personnel. The Packers still need somebody to emerge at that right guard spot offensively as well, but to me the biggest need by far is on the opposite side of the ball. Head coach Matt LaFleur has lost 8 games in his 2 years in Green Bay, and when you look at the stats of those contests, his team has allowed an average of 160 yards on the ground, and the only time that number wasn't in that range was this NFC Championship game back in January, when we already pointed out the biggest culprit in Kevin King. Kenny Clark is an excellent player at the nose when healthy. They could use some help around him on that D-line, but what they really need is players on that second level who actively fill holes and have some range to not be completely exploited in coverage. Now Giants linebacker Blake Martinez has certainly improved in New York after he had his issues back with his old team that were masked by the high tackling numbers, but the Packers have only gotten worse in that area of the field. Let me know how many of these guys you knew were on that roster, or even knew altogether. Chris Barnes, Kamal Martin, Oren Burks, Devondre Campbell, and rookie Isaiah McDuffie. Other than Campbell, none of these guys have been able to establish themselves as starters for longer stretches at any point in the league really, and he's already on his third team in 3 years now himself. I thought Kirksey was a nice under-the-radar addition last year for very little money, but he definitely took a step back, and they didn't extend him. Chris Barnes led this group of 80 tackles, but a lot of those were drag downs that I wouldn't count as positives necessarily, and the rest was mostly limited to certain sub-packages and special teams. I think Campbell could give them some stability in the middle, although I wouldn't expect more than what they got from Kirksey last season, and they need somebody with range as a pursuit defender and in coverage to complement him. I like Isaiah McDuffie, the rookie out of Boston College, as a sub-package piece if he can learn to be more patient in space, but he's like 225 pounds and it shows. The Packers will try to put as little linebackers on the field as possible probably, but plenty of good NFC teams like to use 12 personnel, so you probably need 2 on the field quite a bit, and I don't even love one of the guys that they have there. So that's a problem for a team that sees themselves as contenders. And finally, the Minnesota Vikings. Watching Minnesota last season, it was the first time in a while that the defense was the unit that really held them back, as running back Dalvin Cook and rookie wide receiver Justin Jefferson were the stars of the show offensively, while they were in the bottom 6 in yards and points allowed. There certainly was some discomfort and almost disgust on the end of Vikings head coach Mike Zimmer last season, when he had to talk about his defense falling apart. Injuries played a major part, as the 2 fixture linebackers missed the majority of the year, and arguably the best player and defensive end Danielle Hunter was out with a scary back problem that we still don't know for sure if it will continue to be an issue. Plus, he reportedly wanted out of Minnesota anyway, although they just restructured his deal at the time that I'm recording this, as I don't know all the facts about it. That's an issue, and my choice for the biggest remaining need because they do have plenty of developmental talent, but nobody that they can rely upon to provide pressure on passing downs on the defensive line, outside of Hunter potentially. The same could be said about the corner situation, but while he's certainly on the decline, Patrick Peterson should bring some leadership to that unit, and I think the young guys at the position are ready to step up. Not so sure about defensive end, however, where DJ Warnham is the returning leader in sacks for this group, with only 3 as a rookie. They brought back Stephen Weatherly after 1 year stint in Carolina, who was a quality rotational piece for them for several years before that. They have a couple more guys inside and out from last year's draft, and then they used a couple of mid-round picks on Pittsburgh's Patrick Jones and Florida State's Janaris Robinson in April, who I both define as toolsy prospects that aren't ready to make an instant impact. Yet that is exactly what Minnesota needs, as even with Hunter, that unit is heavily depending on their one-star player. A couple of years ago, they were able to use Hunter and Everson Griffin oftentimes matched up against guard and put Weatherly on the edge. Now they can't really do that, because they don't have guys that can take advantage of interior pressure as the quarterback needs to bail, which they have 2 natural A-gap defenders on the interior as it is, who will be limited to just pushing up the middle. And if the offensive line slides to Hunter, they don't have that guy that can take advantage of those one-on-ones with speed around the edge. If the Vikings want to have any shot at dethroning the Packers in the North, they need to be able to make Aaron Rodgers uncomfortable. And while they did split the season series last year, Dalvin Cook keeping the ball out of his hands and a bad missed call in the 4th quarter of the second game are the only things that slowed down Rodgers. That brings us to the second division here in the NFC East, starting with the Dallas Cowboys. While the return of Dak Prescott is raising expectations to an absurd level once again, in terms of the way that this team is perceived as the clear NFC betting favorite, I personally bet Washington at plus 375 back in March already, because people forget that the Cowboys were 1-3 and up by just 1 point against the Giants when Dak went down with a gruesome ankle injury. But scoring points wasn't really a problem for them, as they had scored 31.5 on average through those first 4 games. Untimely turnovers were certainly an issue, and they need to start quicker offensively, but they need to stop their opponents to be any type of contender in the NFC. They were in the bottom 5 in points allowed, and only the 4-12 Texans so ran up more yards on the ground last season. Dallas spent the first 6 and 8 of 11 draft picks overall on defense, with 3 corners and the rest of the guys all being front 7 players. Shade nose tackle is still something that they could have attacked more, I believe, as they transition back to a 4-3 and the new defensive coordinator Dan Quinn most likely, but that group up front looks improved to me. The issue is still in the back end, where I believe second rounder Calvin Joseph out of Kentucky will start opposite of Javon Diggs coming into year 2, with a couple of quality options in the slot, while Donovan Wilson made a strong impression over the second half of last season, delivering some big hits and creating turnovers. However, this defense to me is still lacking a true center field and free safety. Quinn has evolved as a defensive play caller to some degree, away from his cover 3 heavy roots from Seattle to more man-to-man and blitzing on a third of the snaps, but he still uses a ton of single high safety looks, even if he doesn't have the proper pieces all the time, like Sherrod Niesman being asked to control the deep middle for the Falcons last season. Not saying that he didn't do a solid job. The former Falcons head coach brought in one of his former players in DeMonte Casey, who was limited to just 4 games last season, but has played well for them when available, more so as a deep safety last season, especially when you saw more 2 high shells from Atlanta early on. But he's coming off a torn Achilles and is very conservative as a last line of defense, who I like better in the slot and closer to the line of scrimmage anyway. And even if that move pays off, they don't really have anybody behind him that I would trust in that kind of role. The 2 next options may be Reggie Robinson II, who I liked as a feisty press corner in last year's draft, apparently being experimented at safety, and maybe even 6th round pick Israel Mukuamu, who is 6'4" and looked atrocious when jumping in that spot last season for South Carolina, so that is definitely not great. And let's talk about the New York Giants, and this might be confusing to some people, because the Giants did finish last season with a 6-10 record, which in the NFC East, if not for the Eagles pulling the quarterback late in game number 256 and almost handing Washington that win on Sunday Night Football to win the division, that could have been enough to host a playoff game. But when I look at this roster, I don't see many real holes necessarily. After the 0-5 start last season, that defense under coordinator Patrick Graham really showed some signs with a ton of different pressure packages and mixing up secondary looks in a New England type of style, and they made some quality additions with second round pick Azeez Ojulari from Georgia, giving them somebody who can win one-on-ones on the edge and bolstering that secondary some more, while really having addressed the offense these last couple of years with heavy investments in the offensive line ahead of last season, and now surrounding quarterback Daniel Jones with talented pass catchers like Kenny Golladay and first-round pick Kadarius Toney from Florida. And I think Danny Dimes receives a bad rap, despite having played fairly well for stretches. When he keeps the ball on zone reads, we've seen him rip off some huge runs, and if not for tripping over his own feet, would have had an 88-yard touchdown on his resume from last year. His arm is better than I thought it was coming out of Duke, and he has surprisingly been one of the top deep passers in the league. The issue for him, of course, have been turnovers, with a lot of his interceptions coming on late throws, at times when the pocket is already collapsing, and his fumbles coming from being too much of a stature back there, where he plays like an 80s quarterback, and at times is completely oblivious to the rush around him, which also leads to a lot of sacks, and that makes no sense considering that he can run and just needs to become more of a playmaker out of structure. If we don't see that, however, or he gets hurt, like he was at the end of last season, and he should have probably not even been out there, they need somebody to come in there who can add some juice, I believe. Colt McCoy was alright last season filling in, not really been asked to do anything individually, but they have only downgraded with Mike Glennon there, who is like the opposite of juice. And the third guy on that roster is Clayton Thorson, who was a 5th round pick for the Eagles 2 years ago out of Northwestern, and is very much in that same mold of a pure pocket passer who doesn't really add any excitement. So if Jones doesn't take that step with better pieces around him, or actually gets hurt, they might have to put the ball in Saquon Barkley's hands 40 times a game. And speaking of the Eagles, this should be an interesting year for Philly, even though it may not be a great one to watch. The whole situation with their Week 17 benchings, then Doug Peterson and his staff getting fired, and new head coach Nick Sirianni getting egg on his face when talking to the media early on was all very bizarre. The roster is still somewhat in transition, and who the hell even knows what they really think about the quarterback Jalen Hurts. I like the additions that they have made in the backfield, and while they just haven't been able to stay healthy, they have the pieces to be a pretty good offensive line, while drafting Devontae Smith will help everybody else out in the receiving corps. Defensively, they might lack some difference makers up front outside of Fletcher Cox, but they do have a deep rotation, and while linebacker has been a weak area for them for several years now, I believe Eric Wilson was a very underrated signing, and they probably look at one of their 6th round picks in LSU's Jacoby Stevens as a dime backer option. I don't really know a ton about the new defensive coordinator Jonathan Gannon, other than he worked under Mike Zimmer and Matt Eberflus, who at heart are cover 3 oriented, even though Eberflus showed a willingness to adapt in Indianapolis when he rarely had his intended free safety Malik Hooker available and ran a lot more too high shells, before finding a gem in Julian Blackmon as a rookie last year, who I love personally as a prospect. Not to get too far off topic here, Gannon has already talked about wanting to orientate a scheme to his players, so it's kind of tough to predict how exactly they want to deploy their pieces in the secondary. My best guess would be Darius Slay and Avonte Maddox on the outside, second-year player K'Wan Wallace in the slot, and using Rodney McLeod and Anthony Harris in an interchangeable fashion almost potentially as those safeties. That group doesn't sound so bad if the scheme doesn't demand a number 1 corner, which I don't really see anymore with an aging Darius Slay, but the issue is what they have behind those starters. Wallace can be more of your hybrid strong safety, and Marcus Epps played some quality snaps for Philly last season. Lavert Hill is a feisty player for Michigan, but went undrafted due to lacking size last year. Plus I liked Zach McPherson as a developmental option at corner, who was the 3rd round pick out of Texas Tech, and almost no fan was recognized anybody beyond that. When you go back to the Eagles' run to the Super Bowl and playoff appearances the following couple of years, depth in the secondary was always a plus. I'm not saying this team is anywhere close to that, but a couple of injuries in the secondary could make the difference between them being a respectable squad that is still lacking pieces to make some noise, and a team that picks in the top 5 come next April. And that brings us to the reigning division champs, the Washington football team. As I've already mentioned, I believe Washington should be favorites to win the East again, even though there's this weird thing about how the division hasn't seen a repeat champion in like almost 2 decades. But the reason I believe Washington should be the favorites is because they have the most complete roster and arguably the best coaching staff. You can make fun of Ryan Fitzpatrick all you want, but he has inarguably been a top 20 quarterback these last couple of years, and therefore at least is a major upgrade over what they had last season. I love the additions that they have made at receiver to add to Terry McLaurin. The defense was already dominant over the second half of last season, and they added some key pieces to it with William Jackson at cornerback and the first round pick Jamin Davis as a rangy player on the second level to clean up some of the chaos that the defensive line will create. So there's very little that you can look at as an actual pressing need for the squad. Therefore I went with my first and only specialist on this list, which might actually be on this roster already, but just hasn't done it in that capacity or really stuck out to me in that fashion. In terms of a return specialist that can really threaten opponents, last year the football team was 21st in kick return and 27th in punt return average, with no touchdowns and a heavy rate of fair catches and touchbacks taken. The two clear guys for them with those duties were Danny Johnson for kickoffs, who's like their 5th or 6th corner and averaged 22 yards per, and Steven Sims on punts, who is a dynamic player with the ball in his hands, but his 6.7 yards per wouldn't suggest that, plus his free muff punts led the league. The only other player to touch the ball on special teams was Isaiah Wright, who was less than impressive on his 5 total attempts. Free agency addition Curtis Samuel did return 10 kicks in each of his first 2 years at Carolina, averaging 21.5 yards per, and Adam Humphries returned a few punts in his career, who could at least make sure that they take over possession, although both will likely be limited to offensive work. So because of that, outside of Johnson, they don't really have anybody somewhat reliable, much less game-changing. I believe the offense will make a big jump for Washington here, but this team will still be built around the defense, so setting up some cheap points off those stops that they can provide would be huge. Let's move on to the third division here, the NFC South. And the first team here, the Atlanta Falcons, they've been kind of sending us mixed signals this offseason, since they gave up that 28-3 lead in the Super Bowl almost 4.5 years ago. They have been in this weird mode where they act like they're contenders and have been a dark horse for some people in the offseason, including yours truly back in 2018 at least, but have finished below 500 in all 3 years since I kind of put that curse on them. I really like the hirings of head coach Arthur Smith and defensive coordinator Dean Pease, and they drafted some of my personal favorites. What's confusing to me, however, is them not taking the chance and using that 4th overall pick that they had on a potential quarterback of the future in Justin Fields in favor of selecting this unique offensive weapon in Florida tight end Kyle Pitts. Don't get me wrong, he was certainly worth the pick, but then to trade away Julio Jones is not even a net benefit probably, unless Julio had to miss several games, which outside of a 9-game schedule this past season actually hasn't been the case when you really look at it, as he hasn't missed more than 2 contests since 2013. I understand the cap situation, and while he hasn't missed as many games as some people may think, Julio has been banged up a lot recently, but I just view the NFL as either you have a chance to win it all, or you have to look at the future and do everything to get there one day. So if they believe that they were in a championship window potentially, which picking 4th overall doesn't really suggest that, the intrigue for Atlanta was to add Pitts to an already dynamic group of receivers, which now won't be the case. Therefore getting Fields to take over on the center at some point, and maybe creating a new window when you have the draft capital to make such a move, would have made a lot of sense to me, since I don't think they'll be as bad to pick that high again next year. So with all that being said, which is more of a general overview of this team, if they do think they can be a playoff team, it's their defense that needs to be more consistent. We did see some flashes from that unit last season, like a 43-6 domination of the Raiders, or holding the Chiefs to just 10 points until a late touchdown. I love the 2nd round pick Richie Grant from UCF, who will be a versatile piece at safety for Dean Pease, and they quietly have some of the more underappreciated front 7 pieces in the league, like Grady Jarrett, Deion Jones, and mostly Foyesade Oluokun, who's somebody, whenever I put on the tape, makes plays for this team, but nobody ever talks about him. What's holding Atlanta back is the youth in the secondary to some degree, where those talented corners experience baptism by fire, and the fact that they need to send extra people to create pressure. I actually think Dante Fowler is much more of an impact player than he gets credit for, or that the numbers might suggest, but they have been trying to find reliable players that can threaten off the edge for a long time now. 1st round picks Vic Beasley and Takk McKinley have left after the 50 options were declined in these last 2 years respectively, and at best they found some number 2s on the open market. Atlanta spent another top 50 selection on Marlon Davidson out of Auburn last year's draft, but he didn't get to see the field a whole lot, and to me might be most dangerous sliding inside on passing downs. After that, it's a lot of names that have been kind of forgotten, like Barkevius Mingo, Stephen Means, and Brandon Copeland. Under the new defensive coordinator, I expect the Falcons to be much more multiple up front and provide pressure through creative blitzes, but when it's one-on-one, it's really only Jared and Fowler that can consistently win those battles. As far as the Carolina Panthers go, they are a very intriguing team to me, with the coaching staff and the young talent that they have acquired since last offseason started. Outside of Christian McCaffrey, they may not have a true superstar on that team, but they have a lot of good football players that people don't really talk about enough. They have some really dynamic receivers, they're close to finally having that O-line fixed, they are like 8 guys deep in the defensive line, they have some versatile pieces on the second level, and now by spending a top 10 pick on one of the most talented cornerback prospects in several years, that position could become a strength for them. I don't think they're all the way there yet, but if Sam Darnold can come even close to the quarterback prospects that he was made out to be coming out of USC 3 years ago, that could turn out to be a steal of a trade for them. We still have to see how some of these pieces fit in, with left guard being the one other spot that I considered pointing out here, where I'm somewhat betting on 6th round pick Deontay Brown to start, but as long as they get solid play at that spot, I think that whole unit could be better than it has been in a while. The area that I look at, which could use some reinforcements, is safety. Best would be a combo option who can play high or low, allow them to be more versatile on the personnel packages, and fill in for either one of the starters if they only use 2 of them. Trey Boston is still currently on the free agent market for some reason, who I believe certainly is a plus starter, and I think he could easily still come back. However, even if he does return to Carolina, they could still add some guys to that room, looking at how much they like to put free safeties on the field at the same time in 2020. Jeremy Chin was the Defensive Rookie of the Year frontrunner for them last season, thanks in part to having Boston and Justin Burris, who officially started all but one of the 13 games that he played. We did see the Panthers use his range and coverage to some degree, but Chin was used more so to match up against tight ends and closer to the ball, oftentimes blitzing on rundowns even. Looking back at Chin's college career and my evaluations of him, we did see him play in a lot of too high looks, but even then I liked him best buzzing down and just going after the ball, rather than diagnosing plays from depth and having to play in a conservative fashion. So I believe they'd be smart to bring back Boston, or maybe give one of those other few safeties on the free agent market a call, because right now Sam Franklin and Delano Hill are the only guys with extended playing experience on that roster, while Kenny Robinson was an interesting mid-round draft pick for them last year, coming over from the XFL, where he was a playmaker similar to his time at West Virginia, but started the year on the practice squad and logged just 1 single tackle as a rookie, so they certainly lack guys that they can trust on the back end, and it could hurt their versatility. That brings us to the New Orleans Saints. So the Drew Brees era is over. Mickey Loomis and the mad scientists, the Saints must have work in there in the catacombs somewhere to figure out how to screw the NFL financial rules. Somehow have been able to manipulate the cap in ways that are inexplicable to me and some of the best analysts out there, because however they do it, they always find ways to pay most of the guys. Having the money available that Drew would have cost certainly helps, but depending on who will emerge between Jameis Winston and Taysom Hill at quarterback, they will have to pay somebody there. They did lose defensive end Trey Hendrickson and cornerback Janoris Jenkins on defense, but they pretty much reloaded at those positions with draft picks Peyton Turner in the 1st and Paulson Adebo in the 3rd round, who have the potential to play at that type of level down the road, with Adebo in particular being somebody who can be a really cheap replacement. The 2 other losses that they suffered, and they went completely unnoticed I thought, were defensive tackles Malcolm Brown, who has moved on to Jacksonville to be a quality rotational player, and Sheldon Rankins, who is now bolstering an already really impressive Jets interior defensive line. The former 12th overall pick back in 2016 certainly didn't continue the type of career trajectory I would have expected from him, with a torn Achilles and a broken ankle late in 2018 and 19 respectively. Last season he posted a career low of 1.5 sacks and only played about 40% of the snaps for a rotation-heavy interior group. That depth is definitely gone now, but even just in terms of the starters, I don't think they have a natural fit at 3 technique necessarily, with David Onyemata and Shai Tuttle being better suited as A-gap defenders in my opinion, and Malcolm Roach as their primary backup, the way it looks like right now, finished last year 8th in terms of snap percentage among defensive linemen for New Orleans. First rounder Peyton Turner has the kind of body type and strength where I could see him add a few pounds for that role, and Cam Jordan likes to slide inside on passing downs anyway, but I don't see that type of penetrating B-gap defender who can create issues in the backfield and force the guy with the ball to run into the arms of the guys on the edges, on base downs at least. And for Tampa Bay Buccaneers, there's not much you can come up with for a Super Bowl champion that brought back every single starter from the year prior, and even some of the key backups. It really is incredible how Jason Light and company managed to bring the band back together and fit them all under the cap somehow to remain the clear favorites to make it out of the NFC this season once again, I would say. I don't want people to forget that they were 7-5 heading into the bye early in December last year, but they went on a great run and finally unleashed the potential of this team, which there's nothing that really holds them back this year to go for having a full offseason, it seems like. I actually wasn't a big fan of the draft, especially using a second round pick on a quarterback in Florida's Kyle Trask that I wasn't too high on in the first place, but looking at that depth chart, it's not easy to find an area that really gives me pause. Rookies Joe Tryon and Robert Hainsey give them depth on the edge defensively, and in Hainsey, somebody I believe can play all 5 spots along the offensive line potentially. People forget that they get back O.J. Howard, who was the number 1 tight end for this team rather than Gronk when he was still healthy, and Giovanni Bernard finally gives them a real receiving threat at the running back position, who will make spreading the field more of a thing when they were really condensed last season to run the ball and take play action shots off that. It's kinda crazy that they even go 3 deep at nose tackle, with Vita Vea of course, Steve McClendon who they brought in when Vea broke his ankle last year, and Raheem Nunez-Roches, who was a fucking rock in the middle for them as well whenever I watched the tape. However, around those guys in the middle is where I think they aren't very deep in my opinion. While the Bucs primarily are nickel anyway, with Vea and Ndamukong Suh as the 2 interior guys, in theory they are still a 3-4 front, with William Golston as a quality kinda under the radar contributor for them. He and Suh can share snaps when they are more in even fronts against teams that spread the field, but when they go to New England or Indianapolis, or maybe even San Francisco in the playoffs, they will be in more base to counter those rushing attacks, and they don't have many 4-4-eye, or even 3 techniques on the roster. Khalil Davis was a late round pick out of Nebraska for them last year, who flashed some potential as a pass rusher in college, but was exposed against double teams in the run game. Patrick O'Connor and Mal Ledbetter only played about 5% of the snaps themselves last season, and then you look into maybe putting Anthony Nelson inside. So if I had to look at one position group where they could still add a couple of free agents that will go there for cheap, for a chance to get a ring, that would be it. And today, which I believe is the best group of 4 we have in the league, we're looking at the NFC West, starting with the Arizona Cardinals. While we don't see them receive the kind of hype that we've seen from some of these super teams in recent years, simply because they are from one of the smallest markets in the league, they did add a lot of aging star players like J.G. Watt, Malcolm Butler if you want to count him for that, A.J. Green and Rodney Hudson, with the latter one being at worst at the later stages of his prime. I actually believe those guys can add some veteran leadership and get this team to take the next step, but the development of the homegrown players is what will determine where this team may go, and when you look at quarterback Kyler Murray coming into year 3, I think the interior offensive line providing space for him at 5'10 will be huge, because we saw in the second half of the season, after an incredible start, that he's not comfortable in tight quarters and with push up the middle, which some teams like New England and the Rams used, sending guys through those interior gaps and having those guys on the edges go wide to not allow Kyler to get out there. So I'm not fully sold on Brian Winters at right guard, but he did play fairly well filling in for Buffalo last season, and Rodney Hudson is an elite pass protecting center. So my focus shifts to players who can help the quarterback become more comfortable when the space isn't really there, and then encourage him to work the middle of the field despite lacking height. Even though the air raid offense isn't necessarily looking to get the tight end involved, and Cliff Kingsbury hasn't made the position a priority, Dan Arnold was a quality contributor for this Cardinals squad last season, as he finished third on the team in receiving yards and actually led the group with 14.1 yards per grab. So he may never be a star player, but he carved out a nice role for himself on that squad, whether it was converting first downs with spots and pivot routes back to the inside, or bending down the seams. I liked what I saw from him, and 24 of 31 catches going for first downs is a big deal. The Cards still have that type of player in Max Williams, who was a highly touted second round pick for Baltimore a few years ago, but he could not step up when given the chance these last 2 years. Darrell Daniels caught 8 passes for just under 100 yards last season, after he was only at 4 career receptions up to that point, and then you really only have 3 undrafted rookies in Kerry Angeline Ian Bunting, and Bernard Zajkovic, with the latter one of the three being somebody I've seen play in person a few times as he tries to go from Austria to the NFL with a solid chance of actually making that roster. However, I don't think any of these guys are starting for another team in this league probably. And I'm not saying the Cardinals need a hand in the dirt wide tight end or anything like that, because the offense just doesn't use that type of player. But having somebody with that size to give Kyler a big target over the middle, who can shield the ball with his frame, and maybe to loft the ball over the second level, as defenses try to bracket all of the mash concepts and underneath stuff, that would certainly make some sense to me. Plus, Arnold was a weapon in the red zone and showed some toughness getting up after some huge shots. With the Los Angeles Rams, I have very mixed feelings about the way that they approach this offseason. I was a big fan of the Matt Stafford edition, and if he plays at a near MVP level, everything else doesn't really matter, I guess. I get that they might not have had the money to re-sign John Johnson or Troy Hill, but then to not address the secondary in any other way, and for their two biggest investments to be receivers with 175 and 150 pounds, and Deshaun Jackson's a free agent, who has rarely been able to stay healthy these last several years, and second round pick Tutu Atwell from Louisville, who should be the lightest player in the NFL, that leaves me scratching my head. Plus I thought he had one of the least impressive drafts overall. When I look at the way that this team played last season, and consider what I believe is a major upgrade on the center, I think they have the potential to go all the way. But I could have seen them gain some separation on the other teams in the West, and solidify themselves as a top 3 team in the conference. The defense obviously was one of the top units in the entire league last season. With the area they clearly could still use an upgrade at being linebacker. I would personally still like them to address it, but they did use a third round pick on South Carolina's Ernest Jones, who provides them with some range on that second level, and they'll probably be looking to use either Taylor Rapp or maybe Terrell Burgess as their dime backer / overhang defender. So since they were able to mask that weakness last year, I'm going with a need that may not be quite as pressing now, but could turn out to be what holds this team back from making a deep run in the playoffs. And that's adding depth to the offensive line, particularly on the interior. The front 5 looked pretty good last season, and we saw them blow open some nice hole for Cam Akers and Darrell Henderson, who could be among the top duos in terms of rushing yards in 2021. I also like a couple of the young backup tackles based on my college evaluations at least, with Joseph Noteboom looking okay when filling in the left tackle last season, while Bobby Evans struggled when being thrown into the fire as a rookie in 2019 at right tackle. Either way, they're clearly offensive tackle prospects to me, and wouldn't fare as well on the inside, which we saw from Noteboom when he looked pretty rough filling in the guard the year prior. And outside of Brian Allen, they only have one school center on that roster, which is undrafted free agent Jordan Meredith, who we don't even know will make this team at all, with the other UDFA addition up front being Alaric Jackson from Iowa, who looked atrocious at guard, and overall, to be honest, during Senior Bowl week. Plus they have Jamil Demby, who is already in his second stint in LA in 3 years, and is barely holding on to a spot in the practice squad, so injuries could really decimate that unit, and we have seen how much they have struggled offensively just 2 years ago with one of the worst offensive lines in the whole league. Now let's talk a little bit about the San Francisco 49ers. Call me crazy, but I think the Niners have a chance to go all the way if they just get above average quarterback play. They may not be quite as good as they were a couple of years ago, when they were up by 10 points over Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs in the fourth quarter of the Super Bowl, in terms of the entire roster and coaching staff, but they aren't too far off that, and I believe Trey Lance could be an upgrade over Jimmy Garoppolo as a rookie already, if he can grasp the totality of the offense, which he kind of ran a simpler version of at North Dakota State. Offensively, I don't really see any issues, because I think going back to the comparison with the 2019 squad, Brandon Ayuk is a more dynamic player than Emmanuel Sanders as the X-receiver, Trent Williams just got paid like the top left tackle in football, and is an upgrade over Joe Staley, who was on the brink of retirement back then. Plus I think they have an even deeper backfield. And on defense, Javon Kinlaw still has a way to go to step onto the shoes of DeForest Buckner, but the rest of that group is still basically intact, with Fred Warner emerging as an elite linebacker. And this is not supposed to be a hot take at all. A healthy Jason Verrett to me is better than Richard Sherman was for them. Herein lies the issue, however, because this was the first season since frickin' 2015 that Verrett has played any significant portion of games, and even if it does stay healthy, their cornerback depth chart doesn't look overly impressive. Emmanuel Mosley is currently slated to start alongside Verrett, I would say, with Kwan Williams remaining in the nickel, who missed some time last year. Dante Johnson is the one other veteran who has played some good snaps for this team as well, but he's already there for a second time. And then it's up to two rookies, 3rd round pick Ambry Thomas from Michigan and 5th rounder Diomodor Lenore from Oregon, both feisty, undersized corners who I projected to land in the slot personally. For the Niners, at least one of them could see some significant time on the outside, as we don't know for sure what to expect coverage-wise from DeMeco Ryans taking over as the new defensive coordinator. However, assuming that they stick with some of those cover-free principles and then play more man on 3rd downs, at least to some degree, those rooks don't really have the prototype measurements for corners in that system. I believe Ambry Thomas in particular has a chance to impress coaches in training camp with how relentless he's at ripping the ball out, but they don't have much veteran depth, I would say at least. And for the final team of the day, the Seattle Seahawks have had a potentially tumultuous offseason, I would say, that quickly cooled off when the Russell Wilson explosion was avoided. It's probably BS that Russ had never said he wanted to be traded. When you look at all the signals coming from his camp, he didn't actually have to say it. And I think the situation isn't completely done because we may have to revisit next offseason. But for now, they are focused on 2021. Offensively, they did lose a couple of tight ends, but overall I believe upgraded at that spot with Gerald Everett from the division rival Rams. Their 11 personnel grouping became more dynamic by drafting Western Michigan's Dwayne Eskridge in the 2nd round, and they definitely received a boost from Gabe Jackson taking over one of those guard spots. Defensively, they quietly lost their 2 starting corners from a year ago, but one of them was only available for about half the year, and the other one got highly paid in free agency. While when you look at the guys that are still there, DJ Reed looked really good when he had to step in, Pierre Desir was a bargain signing, and I love 4th round pick Trey Brown from Oklahoma, as they may be transitioning to more of an off-coverage, blitz-heavy approach. KJ Wright might still be coming back, and up front, Alden Smith and Kerry Hyder could pay some major dividends on the edges to go with some of the young guys that they already had there. Poona Ford is a very underrated one technique for them, but the loss of Jerron Reed is something that can't be overlooked, as he brought them a disruptive force shooting up the B-gap. Al Woods will likely step in at that free technique spot, but to me he's a nice rotational player rather than a difference maker. Rasheem Green, the 3rd round pick from 2018, has that type of inside-out versatility, at least on passing downs, and so does Algie Collier, who they picked in the 1st round the year after. So there are some options here in theory, but none of these guys are really natural fits there, I would say. Usually I'd say you're in sub most of the time anyway, but we still have to see this team do that, as they are in a completely different league to the rest of the NFL when you look at personnel splits, and you peek at their schedule with a trip to Indy right off the bat, their 2 meetings with San Francisco and others. They'll need some guys who can defend the run on the interior, especially with how aggressive they want to be on 3rd downs with the blitz packages, which they'll get burned for if it's constantly 3rd and 3, maybe 3rd and 5, so that spot could still use an upgrade. And that's gonna do it for the NFC side of things. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, share it with a couple of friends who would enjoy this off-season content. Like I said, make sure to check out my write-up on the most improved position groups of this offseason. Link for that is down below in the description, and so are my social media handles if you want to get into contact with me or just stay up to date with my postings. You can also check out my divisional draft breakdown videos here on this YouTube channel, and I'll be back next week with the biggest remaining needs for each team in the AFC. So until then, see you later. Peace!